The ice remembers what men try to forget. Beneath the frozen crust of Antarctica, where temperatures plummet to -80 degrees Celsius and winds scream across the plateau at 200 miles per hour, lies a history that was buried for 60 years. It is a story of ambition, secrecy, and a geopolitical game played on the edge of the world. In December 1938, while Europe stood on the precipice of war, a German ship slipped quietly out of the harbor in Hamburg. Its name was the Schwabenland. It was not a warship. It was not a battleship. It was a cargo vessel converted for exploration, painted in neutral colors, carrying no obvious weapons. But its mission was anything but neutral. On board were 93 men, including a team of scientists, cartographers, and Luftwaffe pilots. Their commander was Captain Alfred Ritscher, a veteran of polar exploration who understood the harsh realities of the Southern Ocean better than almost anyone alive. His orders were classified. His destination was the most remote continent on Earth. His objective was to claim a piece of Antarctica for the Third Reich. This expedition did not happen by accident. It was timed with surgical precision. In 1938, Nazi Germany was expanding its reach across Europe. The Anschluss with Austria had been completed. The Sudetenland crisis was brewing. War was inevitable, and the German Navy knew it needed resources, specifically whale oil. Whale oil was not just for soap or margarine in the 1930s. It was a critical industrial lubricant for machinery, a component for explosives, and a source of glycerin for munitions. Germany imported most of its whale oil from Norway and Britain. In the event of war, those supply lines would be cut. The Antarctic waters offered an alternative, untapped, unclaimed, and rich with whale populations. But there was another reason, one that was whispered in the corridors of the Reich Air Ministry, but never written in official logs. Strategic positioning. Antarctica was the only continent without a sovereign owner. It was a blank space on the map. And in the logic of geopolitical expansion, a blank space is an invitation. The Schwabenland arrived off the coast of Queen Maud Land in January 1939. The ice shelves loomed like white walls against the gray sky. Ritscher did not land. The ice was too unstable, the risks too high. Instead, he launched two Dornier wall-flying boats, named Passat and Boris. These were seaplanes capable of landing on calm ocean water, equipped with cameras and fuel tanks for long-range reconnaissance. Over the course of 3 weeks, they flew 15 survey flights over the continent. They covered 600,000 square kilometers. They took 11,000 aerial photographs. They mapped mountain ranges that had never been seen by human eyes. They named peaks after Nazi officials. They named ice shelves after German states. And then, they did something that would haunt historians for decades. They dropped markers. Thousands of them. Aluminum stakes topped with swastika flags. They were not planted in the ground. They were dropped from the air onto the ice. It was a symbolic claim, a declaration of ownership over a territory that no one could actually occupy. They called it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. The official narrative was economic. Germany needed whale oil. But the timing suggests something deeper. Why send an expedition so close to the outbreak of war? Why allocate resources to a continent that could not be defended? Some historians argue it was a bargaining chip. If Germany controlled the Antarctic whaling grounds, they could leverage them in post-war negotiations. Others suggest it was a contingency plan. If the war went badly, if Europe became untenable, Antarctica offered a remote refuge, a place where a regime could disappear into the ice. There is no evidence of a base being built in 1939. The expedition left after 3 weeks. They returned to Germany with the photographs, the maps, and the data. And then, silence fell. The war began in September 1939. The Schwabenland was requisitioned for naval service. The pilots were sent to the front. The maps were locked in vaults in Berlin. Neuschwabenland existed on paper, but not on the ground. It was a ghost territory, a claim made in ice that would melt under the heat of conflict. For the next 6 years, while cities burned and armies clashed across Europe, Africa, and Asia, Antarctica remained silent. The ice did not care about borders. The whales did not care about flags. But the Allies knew about the German expedition. British intelligence had monitored the Schwabenland's departure. American naval attaches had received reports of the aerial surveys. They knew Germany had mapped sectors of the continent that were previously unknown. And they knew something else. They knew that Germany had developed long-range submarine technology. The Type 9 U-boats could operate far from home ports. They could stay submerged for days. They could carry supplies. The question that kept Allied strategists awake at night was not whether Germany had been to Antarctica. It was whether they had returned. During the war, there were persistent rumors of German supply stations in the Southern Ocean, U-boat sightings near the Antarctic Circle, radio transmissions intercepted from high southern latitudes. Were these myths? Or were they fragments of a hidden reality? The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Third Reich was dismantled. Its leaders were tried at Nuremberg. Its secrets were scavenged by the victors. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to America. Operation Oso Aviacum brought them to the Soviet Union. But what about the Antarctic files? Where were the maps taken by Ritscher? Where were the logs of the Schwabenland? Some were found in Berlin. Some were recovered from sunken U-boats. But some were missing. And in the vacuum of missing information, speculation grew. Did the Nazis build a base? Did they hide something in the ice? Did they escape to Antarctica when the end came? These questions were not just the fodder of conspiracy theorists. They were asked by admirals. They were asked by generals. They were asked by the man who would lead the largest Antarctic expedition in history. His name was Richard E. Byrd. He was an American naval officer. He was a polar explorer. And in 1946, just 1 year after the war ended, he was given command of a fleet that seemed disproportionate to scientific research. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, for 1,700 men. It was called Operation Highjump. Officially, it was training. Unofficially, it was a hunt. The documents sealed in 1946 tell a story different from the press releases. They speak of strategic interests. They speak of securing potential base sites. They speak of denying territory to potential adversaries. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was expanding its reach. Antarctica was still unclaimed territory. If the Nazis had left anything behind, the Americans wanted to find it before the Russians did. If the Nazis had not left anything behind, the Americans wanted to claim the territory anyway. The ice was about to become a battlefield again. Not with guns, but with flags. Not with soldiers, but with scientists. The secret war in Antarctica was not over. It was just entering a new phase. And the key to understanding it lies in the declassified files that were locked away for 60 years. Files that reveal what was known, what was suspected, and what was never admitted to the public. This is not a story of UFOs or secret cities. It is a story of geopolitics, of resources, of power, and of the lengths nations will go to secure an advantage on the edge of the world. The ice keeps secrets, but eventually, the ice gives them up. What follows is the documented history of the German Antarctic expedition, the mystery of Operation Highjump, and the truth about New Swabia that was hidden in the archives until the end of the Cold War. To understand what happened in Antarctica, we must first understand what the 1938 to 1939 German expedition actually accomplished. This is not speculation. This is documented history. The German Antarctic expedition was led by Captain Alfred Ritscher, a respected naval officer and polar explorer. The ship Schwabenland departed Hamburg on December 17, 1938. The crew included meteorologists, geologists, cartographers, and aviation personnel. Their equipment included 2 Dornier wall-flying boats, aerial cameras, and surveying instruments. The mission had 3 stated objectives. First, to identify potential sites for whaling stations. Second, to conduct scientific research on weather patterns and magnetic fields. Third, to map uncharted territory for future German interests. These objectives were recorded in official expedition logs, which were later recovered by Allied forces and declassified in the 1990s. The expedition reached the Antarctic coast on January 19, 1939. The area they explored is now known as Queen Maud Land, a sector of East Antarctica. Over the following 3 weeks, the flying boats Passat and Boreas conducted 15 reconnaissance flights. They flew at altitudes between 500 and 3,000 meters, photographing the ice below with overlapping coverage to create accurate maps. The cameras used were Zeiss RMK models, capable of capturing high-resolution images even in the harsh polar light. The team photographed approximately 600,000 square kilometers of territory. They identified mountain ranges, ice shelves, and potential landing sites. They named features after German geographical locations and officials: the Ritscher upland, the Humboldt Mountains, the Petermann Ranges. These names appear on the maps they produced. The maps are real. They exist in archives today. The most controversial aspect of the expedition was the deployment of markers. The team carried approximately 10,000 aluminum stakes, each about 1 meter in length, topped with a small metal plate bearing the expedition insignia. These were not swastika flags as sometimes depicted in popular accounts. The insignia was a stylized eagle with outstretched wings, a common symbol of German state institutions at the time. The stakes were dropped from the aircraft onto the ice at regular intervals along flight paths. Their purpose was practical: to mark surveyed areas for future reference. They were also symbolic, a declaration of interest in the territory. Under international law in 1939, claiming territory required effective occupation, not just symbolic markers. Germany never established a permanent presence in Antarctica. The markers were a statement of intent, not a legal claim. This distinction is important. The expedition did not establish a base. It did not build structures. It did not leave personnel behind. It surveyed, photographed, and departed. The scientific data collected was substantial. Meteorological observations were recorded at regular intervals. Ice core samples were taken from surface layers. Magnetic field measurements were conducted. Oceanographic data was collected from the ship. This information was valuable for understanding polar weather systems, which affect global climate patterns. The aerial photographs provided the first detailed views of large sections of the Antarctic interior. These contributions to science are documented in expedition reports published in German scientific journals in 1940 and 1941. The reports are technical, focused on geography and meteorology. They do not discuss military applications. They do not mention strategic bases. They do not speculate about future operations. They are scientific documents. When the Schwabenland returned to Germany in April 1939, the expedition was presented to the public as a scientific achievement. Newsreels showed footage of the flying boats taking off from the ship, of the ice shelves, of the team at work. The narrative emphasized exploration and discovery. The economic rationale, whale oil, was mentioned. The geopolitical implications were not. This was standard practice for national expeditions at the time. Britain, Norway, and the United States all conducted Antarctic exploration with similar dual purposes: science and national interest. The German expedition was not unique in this regard. What made it notable in hindsight was the timing. It occurred months before the invasion of Poland. It occurred as Germany was preparing for war. This timing has led to speculation about hidden motives. But speculation is not evidence. The documented objectives were scientific and economic. The documented outcomes were maps and data. Anything beyond that enters the realm of interpretation. After the expedition, the personnel returned to their regular duties. Captain Ritscher continued his naval career. The pilots were assigned to Luftwaffe units. The scientists resumed their academic work. The maps and photographs were archived in Berlin. When the war began in September 1939, Antarctic exploration ceased to be a priority. Resources were redirected to the war effort. The Schwabenland was converted for naval transport. The flying boats were repurposed for maritime reconnaissance. The Antarctic data remained in storage. It was not destroyed. It was not hidden. It was simply set aside. This is an important point. There is no evidence of a secret continuation of the Antarctic program during the war. There are no documents ordering the construction of bases. There are no logs of supply missions to the Southern Ocean. There are no communications discussing Antarctic operations. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is a fact that must be acknowledged. Allied intelligence was aware of the German expedition. British naval intelligence had monitored the Schwabenland's departure from Hamburg. They knew its destination. They received reports from neutral countries about the expedition's activities. After the war, when Allied forces occupied Germany, they searched for polar exploration records. Some were found in the Reich Ministry of Aviation archives. Some were recovered from personal papers of expedition members. These documents were evaluated by Allied analysts. Their conclusions were straightforward. The expedition had conducted legitimate scientific survey work. The territorial markers were symbolic, not substantive. There was no indication of military infrastructure being planned or built. These assessments were classified, not because they revealed secrets, but because they contained information about German scientific capabilities that was still considered sensitive in the early Cold War period. The documents remained classified for decades. They were gradually declassified starting in the 1990s as Cold War restrictions eased. The National Archives of the United States, the British National Archives, and Russian state archives have released portions of the relevant records. Historians have been able to piece together a comprehensive picture of the expedition based on these primary sources. The picture that emerges is one of ambitious exploration conducted under difficult conditions, with scientific and economic motivations occurring at a tense moment in world history. It is a fascinating story without needing to add speculation about secret bases or hidden technologies. The truth is compelling enough. This documented history forms the foundation for understanding what came next, because in 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States launched Operation Highjump. It was the largest Antarctic expedition ever assembled. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, nearly 5,000 personnel. It was commanded by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, one of the most famous polar explorers of the 20th century. The official purpose was training and scientific research. The timing, so soon after the war, raised questions. Why such a massive effort? Why Antarctica? The declassified documents from Operation Highjump provide answers that are more nuanced than simple conspiracy theories suggest. They reveal a complex interplay of scientific curiosity, strategic planning, and emerging Cold War tensions. To understand Operation Highjump, we must first understand the world in 1946. The war was over, but peace was fragile. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was fraying. New lines of competition were being drawn. Antarctica, still unclaimed and largely unknown, represented both an opportunity and a potential vulnerability. The United States was not alone in recognizing this. The Soviet Union was also planning its own Antarctic expeditions. The race for the polar south was beginning, and the legacy of the German expedition, though modest in scale, had demonstrated that Antarctica could be reached, mapped, and potentially utilized. The ice was no longer just a scientific frontier. It was becoming a geopolitical one. Operation Highjump remains the largest Antarctic expedition ever assembled. Its scale was unprecedented. Task Force 68 consisted of 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea. It included 23 aircraft, ranging from seaplanes to helicopters. It carried 4,700 men, including scientists, photographers, naval personnel, and ground crews. It established a main base, Little America 4, on the Ross Ice Shelf. It consumed resources that were still scarce in the aftermath of a global war. Fuel, food, equipment, manpower, all diverted to the frozen south. The operation began in August 1946 and was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It ended in February 1947, after only 5 months. Officially, the reason was weather. The Antarctic winter was approaching earlier than expected. Ice conditions were deteriorating. Unofficially, the reasons were more complex. To understand Operation Highjump, we must understand the man who led it. Admiral Richard E. Byrd was not just a naval officer. He was a celebrity. He was one of the first men to fly over the North Pole. He was one of the first to fly over the South Pole. He understood polar exploration better than any American of his generation. He also understood politics. He knew how to secure funding. He knew how to navigate the bureaucracy of the Navy Department. And he knew how to keep secrets. The official objectives of Operation Highjump were stated in press releases. Project 1, training personnel and testing equipment in cold conditions. Project 2, consolidating American sovereignty over Antarctic territories. Project 3, scientific research in meteorology, geology, and biology. These objectives were legitimate. The Navy did need to test equipment in extreme cold. The United States did want to secure potential base sites. Science was indeed conducted, but the scale of the operation suggested something more. A training exercise does not require an aircraft carrier. A scientific mission does not require nearly 5,000 men. The size of the task force indicated a strategic imperative. In 1946, the United States was the dominant naval power in the world, but the Soviet Union was emerging as a rival. The Cold War was not yet named, but it was beginning. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets were planning their own polar expeditions. There were rumors of Soviet interest in the southern hemisphere. There were also lingering questions about German activity. Although the war was over, the intelligence community had not fully accounted for all German naval movements in the final months of the conflict. Some U-boats had not surrendered. Some personnel were unaccounted for. The possibility of hidden supplies or remote outposts, however unlikely, could not be entirely dismissed without verification. Admiral Byrd's orders were classified. The public saw the press releases. The Navy saw the operational directives. These directives emphasized strategic denial. The United States intended to establish a presence in Antarctica that would prevent other nations from claiming strategic territory. This was not about fighting a war in the ice. It was about controlling access. Antarctica offered potential air routes between continents. It offered potential submarine bases under the ice shelves. It offered monitoring positions for the Southern Ocean. In the emerging geopolitical landscape, leaving Antarctica unclaimed was seen as a vulnerability. Operation Highjump was a statement of intent. It said, the United States was here. The United States had the capability to operate here. And the United States would determine who else could operate here. This aligns with the broader strategy of the early Cold War. Containment was not just about Europe. It was global. The poles were part of that global chessboard. The operation faced immediate challenges. The Antarctic environment was more hostile than anticipated. Ice conditions were severe. Weather patterns were unpredictable. Aircraft suffered mechanical failures due to the cold. Engines froze. Hydraulics failed. Navigation was difficult due to magnetic anomalies near the pole. During the operation, several accidents occurred. One plane crashed, killing 3 men. Another plane disappeared, never to be found. Admiral Byrd himself was involved in an incident where his aircraft had to make an emergency landing due to fuel issues. He was rescued, but the incident highlighted the risks. These accidents were reported in the press, but details were minimized. The narrative focused on success, on mapping, on discovery. But the early termination of the operation fueled speculation. Why leave 2 months early? Was it just the weather? Or was there something else? Some accounts from crew members, recorded decades later, suggested tension. They spoke of unusual sightings. They spoke of radio interference. They spoke of a sense that they were being watched. These accounts are anecdotal. They are not supported by official logs, but they contribute to the mystery surrounding Highjump. The photographic record of Operation Highjump is extensive. The expedition took over 70,000 aerial photographs. These images mapped vast areas of the coastline and the interior. They provided data that is still used by scientists today. They showed no evidence of structures, no evidence of bases, no evidence of human habitation beyond the American camps. The maps produced were detailed and accurate. They filled in blank spaces on the globe. This scientific achievement was real. It was tangible. It was the lasting legacy of the operation. But the strategic questions remained. What did the Navy conclude about Soviet intentions? What did they conclude about German remnants? The reports were classified. They were stored in naval archives. They were not available to the public. This secrecy was standard for the era. National security encompassed a wide range of information. Polar strategy was considered sensitive. Revealing specific objectives could alert adversaries to American priorities. So the files were locked away. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was watching. Soviet intelligence monitored Operation Highjump. They analyzed the ship movements. They reviewed the press reports. They understood the strategic implications. In response, the Soviet Academy of Sciences began planning its own Antarctic expedition. It would not launch until 1955, but the decision was made in the late 1940s. The polar race was underway. The United States had made the first major move. The Soviet Union would respond. This dynamic shaped Antarctic policy for the next decade. Claims were made. Maps were drawn. Flags were planted. But no nation could effectively occupy the continent. The cost was too high. The environment was too harsh. The logistics were too complex. So the competition remained symbolic. Until the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. But that is later in the story. In 1947, the focus was on immediate strategic advantage. Operation Highjump ended with the task force returning to the United States. The men were debriefed. The equipment was stored. The photographs were analyzed. And the files were classified. The declassification of Operation Highjump documents began in the 1990s. Historians gained access to operational logs, intelligence summaries, and correspondence between Admiral Byrd and the Navy Department. These documents reveal the strategic thinking behind the mission. They confirm the focus on Soviet containment. They confirm the interest in potential base sites. They do not confirm the existence of Nazi bases. They do not mention encounters with enemy forces. They describe a challenging scientific and logistical operation conducted in a tense geopolitical environment. This is the documented history. It is less sensational than conspiracy theories, but it is more significant. It shows how Antarctica became militarized in the minds of strategists. It shows how exploration was weaponized for national interest. It shows how the Cold War extended to the ends of the Earth. The ice was not just a frontier. It was a buffer zone. It was a potential battlefield. And the nations of the world were positioning themselves for a conflict that hopefully would never come. Admiral Byrd continued to be involved in Antarctic operations after Highjump. He led Operation Deep Freeze in the 1950s, supporting the International Geophysical Year. This marked a shift from strategic competition to scientific cooperation. But the underlying tensions remained. The bases built during Deep Freeze were civilian in name, but military in logistics. The runways could handle heavy transport aircraft. The supply lines were managed by the Navy. The presence was permanent. Operation Highjump had paved the way. It had demonstrated that sustained operations were possible. It had mapped the terrain. It had identified the challenges. It had established the American footprint. Without Highjump, the later permanent bases might not have been feasible. So the legacy of Highjump is mixed. It was a scientific achievement. It was a strategic maneuver. And it was a source of enduring mystery. The early termination, the accidents, the secrecy. These elements combine to create a narrative that invites speculation. But the documents tell a clearer story. A story of nations navigating a new world order. A story of power projected onto the ice. And a story of secrets kept not because they were extraordinary, but because they were strategic. The ice held many secrets. But the most important ones were not about what was hidden in the snow. They were about what was hidden in the files. And those files are now open. What they reveal changes our understanding of the early Cold War. It shows that the competition for global influence was truly global. From Berlin to Antarctica, from the streets of Europe to the ice of the South. The war was over, but the struggle for position had just begun. While the United States was launching Operation Highjump, the Soviet Union was observing, analyzing, and planning. The Soviet response to American activity in Antarctica was not immediate. It took nearly a decade for the USSR to mount its own major expedition. But the decision was made in the late 1940s, in the same classified rooms where American strategy was being formulated. The Soviet Antarctic program was coordinated by the Academy of Sciences, but it was supported by the Navy and the Ministry of Defense. This dual structure, scientific and military, mirrored the American approach. The stated objectives were research, meteorology, glaciology, geophysics. The unstated objectives were strategic, presence, mapping, and denial. The first Soviet Antarctic expedition departed in 1955. It established Mirny Station on the coast of Queen Maud Land, the same region the Germans had surveyed in 1939. This was not a coincidence. The Soviets were familiar with the German maps. They had acquired some of the Ritscher expedition documents after the war. They knew where the Germans had flown. They knew what areas had been photographed. And they wanted to verify, to expand, and to claim. The Soviet expeditions were massive undertakings. They used icebreakers, cargo ships, and aircraft. They built permanent stations. They conducted year-round research. They mapped vast areas of the interior. The scientific output was substantial. Soviet glaciologists made important discoveries about ice sheet dynamics. Meteorologists contributed to global weather models. Geologists identified mineral deposits. This work was legitimate and valuable, but it occurred within a geopolitical framework. Every station was a statement of presence. Every map was a claim of knowledge. Every flight was a demonstration of capability. The Soviets did not drop markers with swastikas. They planted flags with hammer and sickle. They named features after Soviet heroes, scientists, and communist ideals. The competition was not just about territory. It was about ideology, about proving which system could conquer the harshest environment on Earth. Antarctica became a stage for the Cold War, not with weapons, but with flags, not with soldiers, but with scientists and parkas. The declassification of Antarctic documents from this period has been gradual and incomplete. American files from Operation Highjump were released in stages starting in the 1990s. Soviet files have been slower to emerge. The Russian state archives have opened some materials related to the early Antarctic program, but many documents remain classified. The reasons are not necessarily sinister. Some contain technical data about navigation or communications that is still considered sensitive. Some involve personnel records that are protected by privacy laws. Some simply have not been processed for release. Bureaucracy, not conspiracy, often explains secrecy. However, the partial declassification has allowed historians to piece together a clearer picture. We now know that both superpowers viewed Antarctica through a strategic lens. We know that they monitored each other's activities. We know that they planned for potential conflict scenarios, however unlikely. And we know that they ultimately chose cooperation over competition. This choice led to the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. The Antarctic Treaty is one of the most successful international agreements in history. It was signed by 12 nations in 1959 and entered into force in 1961. Its core provisions are simple but profound. First, Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Military activities, such as weapons testing or base establishment, are prohibited. Second, scientific investigation and cooperation shall continue. Third, territorial claims are frozen. No new claims can be made. Existing claims are not recognized, but they are not invalidated. They are held in abeyance. Fourth, nuclear explosions and radioactive waste disposal are banned. These principles have held for over 60 years. 54 nations are now parties to the treaty. Antarctica remains a continent dedicated to peace and science. This outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate diplomacy, of leaders recognizing that competition in such a fragile environment could benefit no one, of scientists advocating for cooperation across political divides. The treaty did not erase the strategic interests that drove early expeditions. It channeled them into a framework that prevented conflict. The role of the German Antarctic expedition in this story is often misunderstood. Popular accounts sometimes suggest that Nazi activity in Antarctica was a major factor in post-war strategy. The declassified documents do not support this. The German expedition was noted. Its maps were studied. Its methods were analyzed. But it was not seen as an ongoing threat. By 1946, Germany was defeated. Its navy was dismantled. Its scientific institutions were under Allied control. The possibility of hidden bases or escaped personnel was considered, but it was not a primary driver of American or Soviet policy. The real drivers were the emerging rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Antarctica mattered because it was unclaimed, not because the Germans had been there. The German expedition was a historical footnote in the larger narrative of Cold War polar strategy. This is not to diminish its historical interest. The 1938 to 1939 expedition was a remarkable achievement of exploration under difficult circumstances. But its geopolitical impact was limited. The maps were useful. The data was valuable. But the territory was never occupied. The claim was never enforced. And after the war, it was irrelevant. The declassification process itself is a story worth telling. Why were documents sealed for 60 years? The answer lies in the nature of Cold War secrecy. Information was classified not only to protect sources and methods, but to control narratives. Revealing strategic assessments of Antarctica could have alerted adversaries to American priorities. It could have sparked diplomatic tensions with claimant nations like Britain, Norway, or Australia. It could have complicated the delicate negotiations that led to the Antarctic Treaty. So the files were kept closed, not because they contained shocking secrets, but because they contained sensitive policy discussions. When they were finally released, historians expected revelations. What they found was nuance, complex decision-making, competing priorities, and a gradual recognition that cooperation served national interests better than competition. This is a common pattern in declassified history. The secrets are often less dramatic than speculation suggests, but they are more instructive. They show how governments actually work, how decisions are made, how strategies evolve. The scientific legacy of these early expeditions is enduring. The aerial photographs taken by the Germans in 1939, the Americans in 1946, and the Soviets in the 1950s provide a baseline for studying climate change. Scientists today compare those images with modern satellite data to measure ice sheet retreat, glacier flow, and coastal erosion. The weather observations collected decades ago help model long-term climate patterns. The geological surveys identified resources and hazards. This scientific continuity is one of the positive outcomes of the Cold War competition. The race to map Antarctica accelerated our understanding of the continent. It created a foundation for international research that continues today. The stations built during this era, McMurdo, Vostok, Mirny, Halley, are still operating. They are hubs of global science. They host researchers from dozens of countries. They study everything from astrophysics to microbiology. The competition that drove their construction has given way to collaboration that sustains them. This transition is a testament to the power of diplomacy, to the vision of the Antarctic Treaty, and to the recognition that some frontiers are best explored together. But the mystery persists in the public imagination. Why? Because secrecy breeds speculation. Because the unknown is fertile ground for stories. Because the idea of Nazi bases in Antarctica is compelling. It combines history, adventure, and conspiracy. It offers a narrative that is more exciting than bureaucratic strategy. Documentaries, books, and films have explored this theme. Some are careful to distinguish fact from fiction. Others blur the lines. As consumers of historical content, we have a responsibility to seek verified information, to consult primary sources, to understand the difference between documented history and creative interpretation. This does not mean we cannot enjoy a good mystery, but we should know when we are engaging with evidence and when we are engaging with entertainment. The story of Antarctica in the mid-20th century is fascinating enough without embellishment. It is a story of human ambition, of technological achievement, of geopolitical maneuvering, and ultimately, of a choice to prioritize peace over conflict. That choice is the real legacy. Not secret bases, not hidden technologies, but the decision to dedicate a continent to science and cooperation. A decision that remains relevant as we face new global challenges. Climate change, resource scarcity, international tension. Antarctica offers a model, not of perfection, but of possibility, of nations setting aside differences to protect a common heritage. The ice remembers, and it teaches. Despite the diplomatic success of the Antarctic Treaty, the questions surrounding the German expedition and Operation Highjump did not disappear. They migrated from classified files to public imagination. The secrecy that once served strategic purposes now fueled speculation. Why were documents sealed for 60 years? Why did Operation Highjump end early? Why did the Germans go so close to war? In the absence of official answers, unofficial narratives filled the void. The most persistent myth is that of Base 211, a secret Nazi installation built beneath the ice, powered by advanced technology, housing escaped leaders and advanced weapons. This narrative has been explored in books, films, and documentaries. It is compelling. It offers a hidden history, but it is not supported by evidence. To understand why, we must look at logistics. A permanent base in Antarctica requires massive infrastructure, power generation, heating, food supply, waste management, maintenance. The German expedition of 1938 to 1939 lasted 3 weeks. They did not land. They did not unload construction materials. They did not leave personnel. The idea that they returned later to build a secret base contradicts the known movements of the German Navy. By 1941, the Kriegsmarine was stretched thin. U-boats were needed in the Atlantic. Surface ships were needed in the North Sea. Diverting resources to Antarctica would have been strategically indefensible. There are no logs of such missions. There are no supply records. There are no personnel assignments. The silence in the archives is deafening. The U-boat theory is more nuanced. German submarines did operate in the Southern Ocean. Operation Eisbar in 1942 involved U-boats rounding the Cape of Good Hope to attack shipping near Madagascar. Some of these submarines had the range to reach Antarctic waters. There are documented sightings of U-boats in high southern latitudes. There are intercepted radio transmissions from south of the Antarctic Circle. But sighting a submarine is not evidence of a base. U-boats could surface in remote bays to recharge batteries or take on fresh water. This does not require a permanent structure. It does not require a colony. It is consistent with standard naval operations. The idea that they were supplying a secret base is an inference, not a fact. After the war, Allied intelligence investigated these claims. They interrogated German naval officers. They reviewed logs. They found no evidence of Antarctic bases. They found evidence of reconnaissance, of interest, but not of occupation. The distinction is critical. Interest does not equal presence. Reconnaissance does not equal colonization. The fate of the Schwabenland itself is documented. It was not spirited away to the ice. It was requisitioned by the German Navy in 1939. It served as a seaplane tender in the North Sea and the Baltic. It was involved in the invasion of Norway in 1940. It survived the war. It was taken as a war prize by the United States in 1945. It was studied. It was scrapped in 1948. Its history is tracked. Its movements are recorded. It did not vanish. It did not escape. It followed the standard path of German naval vessels during and after the conflict. Similarly, the fate of Captain Alfred Ritscher is known. He was captured by British forces in 1945. He was interrogated about his polar experience. He was released in 1946. He lived in Hamburg until his death in 1963. He wrote about his expedition. He gave interviews. He did not speak of secret bases. He did not speak of hidden technologies. He spoke of ice, of wind, of navigation, of science. If there had been a secret, he was part of it. But his documented life suggests there was no secret to keep. He was an explorer, not a guardian of a hidden realm. So why does the myth persist? Partly because of the secrecy itself. When governments classify documents, people assume the worst. If the files were empty, why lock them? The answer is bureaucracy. Information is classified by default in times of war and Cold War tension. Declassification requires review. Review takes time. Time creates suspicion, partly because of the environment. Antarctica is unknown to most people. It is vast. It is white. It is empty. It is a blank canvas onto which stories can be projected. A secret base in the Alps is plausible. A secret base in Antarctica is unverifiable. You cannot go check. The ice protects the mystery, partly because of popular culture. Science fiction has long used Antarctica as a setting for hidden discoveries. From Lovecraft to modern films, the idea of ancient secrets under the ice is a recurring trope. When real history intersects with these tropes, the lines blur. Operation Highjump becomes a hunt for UFOs. The German expedition becomes a quest for occult power. The historical reality is less dramatic, but it is more human. It is about nations competing for position, about explorers pushing limits, about scientists seeking knowledge. These stories do not need embellishment. They stand on their own. The declassified documents do contain surprises, just not the ones expected. They reveal the extent of American anxiety about Soviet expansion. They show that the United States considered claiming sectors of Antarctica unilaterally before the treaty. They reveal discussions about mining rights, about potential military use of icebergs, about weather control experiments. These are the real secrets, not Nazi bases, but Cold War strategies that sound almost fantastical. The idea of weaponizing ice, of modifying weather, of using the polar regions as testing grounds for global dominance. These plans were considered. Some were tested. Most were abandoned. But they exist in the files. They are more revealing about the era than any conspiracy theory. They show a world where nothing was off limits, where the ends of the earth were seen as strategic assets, where science was intertwined with security. This is the true hidden history, not of escaped Nazis, but of superpowers playing chess on a frozen board. The human cost of this competition is often overlooked. Operation Highjump resulted in deaths. Men froze. Planes crashed. Ships were damaged. The German expedition faced storms that could have sunk the Schwabenland. The Soviet stations endured winters where temperatures dropped below -80 degrees. Fires broke out. Supplies ran low. Isolation took a psychological toll. Men spent years cut off from the world, living in small huts, eating canned food, breathing recycled air. This is the reality of polar exploration. It is not glamorous. It is hard. It is dangerous. It requires sacrifice. The men who went there were not soldiers hunting enemies. They were sailors, scientists, and engineers doing a job. They deserved recognition for their work, not association with myths. Recognizing their actual contributions is more respectful than turning them into characters in a fiction. They mapped a continent. They advanced science. They survived conditions that would kill most people. That is enough. That is heroic enough. As we move further into the 21st century, the focus on Antarctica has shifted again. The strategic competition has diminished. The scientific cooperation has deepened. But new challenges have emerged. Climate change is transforming the continent. Ice shelves are collapsing. Glaciers are retreating. The data collected by Ritscher in 1939 and Byrd in 1946 is now crucial. It provides a baseline. It shows us how much the ice has changed. The maps made for military navigation are now used to model sea level rise. The weather stations built for strategic advantage now track global warming. The legacy of the Cold War is being repurposed for planetary survival. This is an ironic twist. The tools of competition are becoming the tools of cooperation. The secrets of the past are illuminating the dangers of the future. The ice is melting, and as it melts, it reveals more than just old markers. It reveals the fragility of our environment. The history of Antarctic exploration is not just about who was there. It is about what we are losing. The maps from 1939 show ice extents that no longer exist. The photographs from 1946 show coastlines that have retreated. The data is a record of change, and it is accelerating. This brings us to the ethical dimension of secrecy. Was it right to classify this information for 60 years? From a national security perspective, yes. In the context of the Cold War, revealing strategic assessments could have destabilized negotiations. It could have provoked arms races in new domains. But from a public knowledge perspective, no. History belongs to everyone. The stories of explorers, the data collected, the decisions made, these are part of our shared heritage. Keeping them hidden breeds distrust. It allows misinformation to flourish. The gradual declassification is a positive step, but it must continue. There are still files locked away, still records unprocessed, still stories untold. The process of openness is as important as the information itself. It signals a commitment to truth, to transparency, to the idea that democracy requires an informed citizenry. The ice kept secrets because it was frozen. The files kept secrets because they were locked. Both are thawing, and what emerges is a complex picture, not of simple heroes and villains, but of humans navigating uncertainty, making decisions with incomplete information, trying to secure advantage in a changing world. This is a universal story, not unique to Antarctica, but sharply defined there, on the edge of the map, where the choices are stark and the consequences are global. The turning point from competition to cooperation did not happen overnight. It was forged in the laboratories and field camps of the International Geophysical Year. From July 1957 to December 1958, 67 nations collaborated on a global scientific project. It was the largest scientific undertaking in history up to that point. Antarctica was the centerpiece. 12 countries established 65 research stations on the ice. Among them were the United States and the Soviet Union, former enemies, nuclear rivals. Yet on the Antarctic continent, they shared data. They coordinated logistics. They rescued each other's personnel in emergencies. This was not altruism. It was pragmatic diplomacy. Scientists realized that understanding the Earth's magnetic field, weather patterns, and ionosphere required global coverage. No single nation could do it alone. The ice demanded cooperation. The Cold War demanded competition. In Antarctica, science won, but the military shadow remained. The stations built for the geophysical year were constructed by naval engineers. The supplies were delivered by military transport. The communication systems were secured. The infrastructure was dual use, capable of supporting science today, capable of supporting strategy tomorrow. This duality was written into the Antarctic Treaty negotiations. The declassified files from this period reveal the specific strategic concerns that drove the treaty. It was not fear of Nazi bases. It was fear of nuclear escalation. In the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. The shortest path between the superpowers was over the poles. The Arctic was the primary corridor, but the Antarctic offered potential monitoring stations. Radar installations could track missile launches. Submarines could operate under the ice shelves. Communications could be relayed through polar orbits. The treaty banned military activities not because nations were suddenly peaceful, but because they recognized that militarizing Antarctica would destabilize the balance of power. If the US built a base, the USSR would build a base. Then another. Then another. The continent would become a fortified zone, a new front in the Cold War. By declaring it neutral, both sides removed a potential flashpoint. This was arms control by geography, a recognition that some places are too valuable to occupy, too fragile to weaponize. The German expedition of 1939 was referenced in these negotiations, not as a threat, but as a precedent. Germany had shown that mapping was possible. The US and USSR had shown that occupation was costly. The treaty froze all claims, including the German claim. New Swabia ceased to exist legally. It became a historical footnote, a name on an old map. The exchange of data during the geophysical year included the German aerial photographs from 1939. For the first time, the Ritscher expedition maps were shared internationally. American cartographers compared them with their own high-jump images. Soviet scientists compared them with their Mirny station surveys. The German data was accurate. The navigation was precise. The photography was high quality. It was a testament to the skill of the 1938-39 team, but it also revealed the limitations. The Germans had mapped the coast. They had not penetrated the interior. The Americans had flown further inland. The Soviets had established permanent ground truth. Together, the three datasets created the first comprehensive map of Queen Maud Land. This collaboration was symbolic. German science, once weaponized for expansion, was now contributing to global knowledge. American strategy, once focused on denial, was now enabling access. Soviet secrecy, once absolute, was now sharing data. The ice had forced a reconciliation, not of ideologies, but of methods. Science became the neutral language. Data became the currency, and the continent became the common ground. The human stories from this era are often overlooked. The men who wintered over in the 1950s lived in isolation that is hard to imagine today. No internet, no satellite phones, no rapid evacuation. If you got sick, you were treated by a medic with limited supplies. If the station burned down, you waited for the next summer ship. At the Soviet Vostok station, temperatures dropped to -89 degrees Celsius, the lowest naturally occurring temperature ever recorded on Earth. Men lived there for years. They developed routines. They celebrated holidays together. They wrote letters that took months to arrive. They formed bonds that transcended nationality. American scientists traded cigarettes for Soviet vodka. British glaciologists shared data with Japanese meteorologists. German researchers consulted with American cartographers. These interactions were small, but they built trust. They created a community. When the treaty was signed in 1959, it was not just politicians in Washington who made it possible. It was the men on the ice who proved that cooperation worked. They showed that rivals could share a continent, could share resources, could share risks. This grassroots diplomacy was as important as the formal negotiations. It provided the evidence that peace was feasible, not just desirable, feasible. The nuclear ban provision in the treaty was groundbreaking. It was the first time an entire continent was designated nuclear-free. This set a precedent for later treaties banning nuclear weapons in space, on the seabed, and in Latin America. The Antarctic model was exported. The idea that certain zones should be exempt from superpower competition gained traction. This was a direct response to the fears of the 1940s and 50s. The fear that every piece of territory would become a potential battlefield. The treaty said, not this one. This one is for science. This one is for peace. The enforcement mechanism is unique. Any party can inspect any station, unannounced, to verify compliance. This has happened dozens of times. American teams have inspected Russian stations. Russian teams have inspected American stations. They check logs. They tour facilities. They confirm no weapons are present. This transparency is rare in international relations. It works because the stakes are low. No one wants to violate the treaty. The cost of expulsion from the Antarctic community is too high. The benefit of cheating is too low. There are no resources worth stealing. No strategic position worth holding. The ice neutralizes ambition. It makes conquest pointless. This is the ultimate security. Not weapons, but irrelevance. Antarctica is too harsh to occupy, too expensive to militarize, too valuable to destroy. The legacy of Operation Highjump is visible in this system. The runways built at McMurdo Station are still used today. They were constructed by Navy Seabees in the 1950s. They were designed for heavy transport aircraft. They enable scientists from around the world to reach the interior. The logistics network established by Byrd's task force is the backbone of modern Antarctic operations. The fuel depots, the supply chains, the communication systems, all originated in the strategic planning of the 1940s, repurposed for science. This is the irony of the Cold War. The tools built for conflict became the tools for cooperation. The maps made for targeting became the maps for conservation. The stations built for monitoring became the stations for climate research. This transformation was not automatic. It required deliberate choices by scientists, by diplomats, by leaders who recognized that the future required collaboration. The German expedition started the mapping. The American expedition expanded it. The Soviet expedition permanentized it. The treaty protected it. Each step built on the last. Even the enemies contributed. Even the secrets served a purpose. The classified files protected the negotiations. The declassified files educate the present. The history is layered. Like the ice itself, core samples reveal past climates. Historical records reveal past decisions. Both are needed to understand the present. As we examine the declassified documents today, we see the evolution of thought. In 1946, the focus was on denial. Keep others out. In 1955, the focus was on presence. Establish bases. In 1959, the focus was on cooperation. Share the continent. This shift reflects the broader evolution of international relations. From imperialism to containment to multilateralism. Antarctica is a microcosm of this journey. It shows how humanity can manage shared spaces, how we can regulate competition, how we can prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. This is a lesson for other global commons. The oceans, the atmosphere, outer space. The Antarctic Treaty is not perfect. It has loopholes. It faces challenges. Tourism is increasing. Fishing is contested. Climate change is accelerating. But the core principle holds. Peaceful use. Scientific cooperation. No weapons. No claims. This framework has survived for over 60 years. Through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Through the Vietnam War. Through the collapse of the Soviet Union. Through the rise of new powers. It has endured because it serves everyone's interest. Even those who are not parties to the treaty benefit from the stability. The weather models improved by Antarctic data protect crops in Asia. The ozone hole discovered by British scientists at Halley Station led to global bans on CFCs. The ice core samples reveal carbon dioxide levels that inform policy in Europe and America. The continent is connected to the world, not by borders, but by systems, by climate, by science, by shared fate. The German claim of New Swabia is now a historical curiosity. It appears on vintage maps. It is discussed in documentaries, but it has no legal standing. It is recognized as part of the broader history of exploration, not as a sovereign territory. The markers dropped by Ritscher's planes are gone, buried by snow, melted into the ice, lost to time. The only thing that remains is the data, the photographs, the logs, the names on the maps. These are the true legacy, not territory, but knowledge. The expedition proved that humans could reach the most remote places, could map the unknown, could survive the extreme. These are universal achievements, not tied to one nation, not tied to one ideology. They belong to humanity. The same is true for Operation Highjump, the Soviet expeditions, the International Geophysical Year. They are chapters in a single story, the story of Antarctic exploration, a story that began with sealing ships and wooden hulls, that progressed to icebreakers and jet aircraft, that continues today with satellites and autonomous robots. The technology changes, the motivation evolves, but the continent remains, constant, unchanging, indifferent to our claims. It will outlast us all. Our flags will rust. Our stations will collapse. Our treaties may expire, but the ice will remain, and it will keep its secrets until we learn to read them, not for power, but for understanding, not for conquest, but for survival. This is the lesson written in the snow, and it is one we are still learning. The end of the Cold War brought a thaw not only in international relations, but in the archives themselves. Throughout the 1990s, As the Soviet Union dissolved and the Iron Curtain fell, historians gained access to documents that had been sealed for half a century. The Russian state archives opened their doors. The American National Archives accelerated declassification. Even German records, scattered across various institutions after reunification, became more accessible. This wave of transparency allowed researchers to cross-reference accounts, to compare the American logs of Operation Highjump with the Soviet records of the Mirny Station, to match the German aerial photographs from 1939 with modern satellite imagery. The result was a clarification of history. Many questions were answered. Some mysteries were dissolved, but others proved more resilient than the facts themselves. The declassified files confirmed the strategic motivations of the superpowers. They confirmed the scientific achievements. They confirmed the absence of military conflict. But they did not stop the speculation. If anything, the release of documents fueled new theories. Because when you release some files, people wonder about the ones still kept closed. Secrecy is a habit of statecraft. It dies hard. Even when the thread is gone, the classification stamps remain. The process of review is slow. Bureaucracies move at their own pace. So gaps remain. And gaps are filled with imagination. The myth of the Nazi base persists not because of evidence, but because of narrative power. It is a story that combines several potent elements. The mystery of the Third Reich, the isolation of Antarctica, the technology of the era, the secrecy of the Cold War. It is a perfect storm for conspiracy. But history requires evidence, and the evidence points elsewhere. The logistical impossibility of maintaining a secret base in Antarctica during the war is well documented. The Allied naval blockade was tight. German surface raiders were hunted down. U-boats were tracked by sonar and air patrol. A supply line to Antarctica would have been vulnerable. It would have required regular voyages. Regular voyages leave records, fuel consumption, port departures, crew manifests. None of these exist for Antarctic missions after 1939. The German Navy was fighting for survival in the Atlantic by 1943. They could not spare submarines for supply runs to the bottom of the world. The idea of escaped Nazis fleeing to Antarctica in 1945 is equally unsupported. The Allied net was closing in Europe. The U-boats that surrendered did so in documented ports. The ones that were scuttled were accounted for. There is no gap in the record large enough to hide a fleet escaping to the south. This does not stop the stories. Because stories serve a purpose. They simplify complexity. They offer hidden hands to explain chaotic events. They provide a sense of order, even if that order is sinister. A secret base is easier to understand than the complex geopolitics of the Cold War. A hidden enemy is more satisfying than the ambiguity of history. But as students of the past, we must resist the comfort of fiction. We must accept the messiness of truth. The true value of the historical records lies not in conspiracy, but in science. The aerial photographs taken by the German expedition in 1939 and the American expedition in 1946 are now critical tools in climate research. Scientists use them to establish baseline data. They compare the ice extents from 80 years ago with today's satellite measurements. They measure the retreat of glaciers. They analyze the thinning of ice shelves. The maps made for navigation are now used for conservation. The weather observations recorded in logbooks are fed into climate models. This is the unintended legacy of the strategic competition. The data collected for power is now used for preservation. The German team wanted to find whaling grounds. The American team wanted to find base sites. The Soviet team wanted to plant flags. But what they all collected was information about the Earth. And that information is now helping us understand how the Earth is changing. The ice cores drilled at Vostok Station, initiated by the Soviets, reveal atmospheric composition going back hundreds of thousands of years. They show the correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature. They show that current levels are unprecedented in human history. This science transcends the politics that enabled it. It is a global resource, owned by no one, used by everyone. The treaty ensures that this data is shared, that samples are exchanged, that findings are published openly. This is the realization of the idealism of 1959, science as a common good. However, the treaty faces new challenges in the 21st century. The strategic competition of the Cold War has been replaced by economic competition. Tourism is booming. Thousands of visitors arrive each summer. They walk on the same ice where Ritscher dropped his markers. They visit the same sites where Byrd built his runways. This brings awareness, but it brings risk, fuel spills, disturbance to wildlife, introduction of invasive species. Fishing is another pressure. Krill harvesting in the Southern Ocean is increasing. Krill is the base of the Antarctic food chain. Overfishing threatens penguins, whales, and seals. The treaty system regulates this through the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. But enforcement is difficult. The ocean is vast. Monitoring is expensive. Nations prioritize their economic interests. Then there is the question of resources. The treaty bans mining, but that ban can be reviewed in 2048. There are known deposits of coal, iron ore, and potentially rare earth elements beneath the ice. As technology improves and resources become scarcer, the temptation to lift the ban will grow. China has established multiple research stations in recent years. They are legitimate scientific facilities, but they are also markers of presence. China is a major player in the treaty system, but it is also a nation with growing global ambitions. How it chooses to use its presence in Antarctica will be a test of the treaty's strength. Will it adhere to the spirit of cooperation, or will it seek advantage? The world is watching. The ice is waiting. The psychological legacy of these expeditions is also worth examining. The men who went to Antarctica in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s faced isolation that is rare in the modern world. They were cut off from communication for months. They relied on each other for survival. This created a unique bond, a sense of camaraderie that transcended national boundaries. Diaries from this era speak of the beauty of the ice, the silence, the aurora australis. They also speak of the fear, the cold that seeped into bones, the storms that lasted for weeks, the knowledge that help was far away. This experience changes people. It humbles them. It makes them aware of their fragility. Many veterans of Antarctic service became advocates for environmental protection. They saw the pristine nature of the continent. They understood what could be lost. Admiral Byrd spoke about this in his later years. He warned against exploitation. He envisioned Antarctica as a natural reserve. This vision influenced the treaty negotiations. The men who knew the ice best were the ones who argued most strongly for its protection. Their testimony carried weight. They had earned the right to speak for the continent. They had suffered there. They had survived there. They knew its value. This human element is often missing from the strategic analysis. The decisions were made by men who had been on the ground, not just by politicians in capitals. This connection between experience and policy is crucial. It reminds us that geography shapes strategy. That environment shapes history. You cannot plan for Antarctica without respecting Antarctica. The ice dictates the terms. Humans must adapt. Those who tried to conquer it failed. Those who learned to cooperate succeeded. As we analyze the declassified documents, we see the evolution of language. In the 1940s, the language is strategic. Denial, sovereignty, security. In the 1960s, it becomes scientific. Cooperation, data, research. In the 1990s, it becomes environmental, conservation, protection, sustainability. This shift reflects the changing priorities of humanity, from conquest to understanding, from exploitation to preservation. Antarctica is the bellwether. It shows where we are going. When the treaty was signed, it was a miracle of diplomacy. Today, it is a necessity. There is no alternative. No nation can claim Antarctica without destabilizing the region. No nation can exploit it without global consequences. The ice connects us all. Sea level rise in Bangladesh is caused by melting in West Antarctica. Weather patterns in Europe are influenced by the polar vortex. The ozone hole discovered over Antarctica affected skin cancer rates in Australia. The continent is not isolated. It is central. It is the engine of global climate. The history of exploration is now the history of interdependence. The German expedition, the American operation, the Soviet stations, they are all part of the same story. The story of humans learning to live on a finite planet, learning that some places should remain untouched, learning that cooperation is stronger than competition. This is the lesson of the ice. It is hard learned. It is still being learned, but it is clear. The secrets of Antarctica are not hidden bases. They are hidden connections between ice and ocean, between past and future, between nations and people. Uncovering these connections is the real work, not digging for ruins. but reading the data, not hunting for enemies, but working with partners. The map has changed, the mission has changed, but the continent remains, and it demands our respect. The archival process continues. New documents are released every year. Historians are still finding letters, logs, photographs. Each piece adds to the puzzle. Sometimes they contradict previous assumptions. Sometimes they confirm them. This is how history works. It is not static. It is revised. It is refined. The story of New Swabia is being rewritten not by conspiracy theorists, but by archivists, by scholars who spend years in dusty rooms reading handwritten notes. They are the real explorers. They are mapping the past, and their maps are accurate. They are based on evidence. They are open to scrutiny. This is the antidote to misinformation. Transparency, verification, peer review. These are the tools of history. They are slower than speculation, but they are durable. A conspiracy theory collapses under questioning. A historical fact withstands it. The German expedition is a fact. Operation Highjump is a fact. The Antarctic Treaty is a fact. The absence of Nazi bases is a fact. These facts are solid. They are the foundation. We can build understanding on them. We cannot build on myths. Myths shift. Facts hold. And in a world of changing climate and changing geopolitics, we need things that hold. We need stability. We need truth. The ice provides both. It preserves the past. It records the present. It warns about the future. The documents do the same. They preserve decisions. They record intentions. They warn about consequences. Together, the ice and the paper tell the same story. A story of ambition, of risk, of hope, and of the enduring human desire to explore the unknown, but also of the wisdom to know when to stop, when to protect, when to share. This wisdom is rare. It is precious. It is what saved Antarctica from becoming a battlefield, and it is what must save it from becoming a casualty of progress. The history is clear. The choice is ours. The physical evidence of these expeditions remains scattered across the ice, subject to the slow erosion of wind and snow. Modern archaeological surveys conducted by the British Antarctic Survey and other international teams have searched the coastal regions of Queen Maud Land extensively. They have found artifacts from the Norwegian whaling expeditions. They have found remains from the British and American bases of the 1950s. They have found nothing from the German expedition of 1938 to 1939 except for a few fragmented records and the photographs themselves. The aluminum markers dropped by the Dornier while aircraft were not designed to last. They were lightweight. They were exposed to the elements. They were buried by snow accumulation over decades. The ice moves. Glaciers flow toward the sea. Anything left on the surface in 1939 has likely been crushed, buried, or carried into the ocean. This absence of physical evidence is often cited by conspiracy theorists as proof of a cover-up. But archaeologists see it differently. It is proof of the environment's power. Antarctica destroys human artifacts. It reclaims them. The ice does not preserve ruins like the desert sand of Egypt. It grinds them down. The lack of structures is not a mystery. It is a geological certainty. Any base built without massive infrastructure would have been obliterated by now. This reality check is important. It grounds the discussion in physical science, in glaciology, in the known behavior of ice sheets. The ice does not keep secrets forever. It reveals them through movement, through melting, through the core samples that tell us about past atmospheres. If there were large structures, they would appear in radar surveys. They do not. The radar maps of the bedrock beneath the ice are detailed. They show mountains. They show lakes. They show canyons. They do not show buildings. This data is public. It is available to any researcher with the skills to read it. The mystery dissolves under scrutiny. The real secret hidden in the declassified files was not about bases. It was about resources. The geological surveys conducted during Operation Highjump and the subsequent Soviet expeditions identified potential mineral deposits. Iron ore, coal, manganese, even traces of uranium. In the 1950s and 60s, these findings were classified, not because they confirmed Nazi activity, but because they represented potential economic value. If it became known that Antarctica held vast reserves of oil or rare earth elements, the pressure to mine would have been immense. The treaty ban on mining was not just environmental. It was strategic. It prevented a resource rush. It prevented nations from claiming sectors based on geological wealth rather than scientific presence. The Protocol on Environmental Protection, signed in 1991, reinforced this ban. It designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It prohibited any activity relating to mineral resources except for scientific research. This decision was contentious. Some nations wanted to keep the option open. Others demanded a permanent ban. The compromise was a 50-year review clause. In 2048, the protocol can be modified. This creates a ticking clock. As technology improves and terrestrial resources become scarcer, the pressure to lift the ban will grow. The declassified geological reports from the 1940s and 50s are now public. They show that the resources exist, but they also show the cost of extraction. The ice is thick. The weather is severe. The logistics are prohibitive. Economically, Antarctic mining is not viable today. But viability changes. Technology changes. The strategic value of the continent may shift from military positioning to resource access. This is the modern geopolitical risk. Not Nazi bases, but economic competition. The treaty system is the only barrier, and it is a barrier based on consensus. If consensus breaks, the barrier falls. This is why the history of these early expeditions matters. They established the presence. They mapped the resources. They set the stage for the current debate. Knowing what was found in the 1940s helps us understand what might be sought in the 2040s. The secrets were not about the past. They were about the future. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain monitored Antarctic activities closely throughout the Cold War. The CIA and the KGB tracked ship movements. They analyzed satellite imagery. They intercepted communications between stations. This was not because they expected an attack. It was because they expected cheating. They wanted to know if the other side was building runways capable of handling military aircraft. They wanted to know if seismic surveys were actually searching for missile silo locations. They wanted to know if nuclear power sources were being used in violation of the treaty. The declassified intelligence reports show a high level of vigilance. Suspicious activities were investigated. Inspections were requested. Most concerns were resolved through diplomacy, but the infrastructure of surveillance remains. Satellites still monitor the continent. Ships are still tracked. The transparency required by the treaty is enforced by technology. This network of observation is a legacy of the Cold War. It was built for suspicion. It is now used for verification. It ensures compliance. It deters violation. The knowledge that you are being watched is a powerful deterrent. The men who designed this system understood human nature. They knew that trust was not enough. Verification was needed. The treaty works not because nations are good, but because they know they are being watched. This is a pragmatic peace, not an idealistic one. It is based on the balance of power, on the knowledge that violation would be detected, and that detection would bring consequences. This system is fragile. It depends on continued cooperation, on continued funding, on continued political will. If any major power withdraws, the system weakens. The history of the 1940s shows what happens when cooperation fails. Competition escalates. Costs rise. Risks increase. The Antarctic model prevents this, but it requires maintenance. It requires vigilance. The ice does not protect itself. Humans must protect it. The preservation of historical sites on the continent is another layer of this legacy. There are huts from the heroic age of exploration. Scott's hut at Cape Evans. Shackleton's hut at Cape Royds. These are preserved as museums. They are protected by the treaty. They are visited by tourists. They are maintained by trusts. But what about the sites from the 1938 to 39 German expedition? There are no structures to preserve, but there are locations. The landing sites of the flying boats. The areas where markers were dropped. These are historically significant. They are part of the human history of the continent. Should they be marked? Should they be protected? This is a complex ethical question. Marking them could be seen as glorifying the Nazi regime. Ignoring them erases history. The current approach is to document them without celebrating them. They are recorded in archaeological registers. They are noted in scientific papers. But there are no plaques, no monuments. This is a deliberate choice. To acknowledge the presence without honoring the ideology. To recognize the achievement of exploration without endorsing the government that funded it. This distinction is important. It allows us to learn from the past without repeating its mistakes. The men who flew the planes were explorers. They were also servants of a criminal regime. Both truths exist. The ice does not judge. It simply covers. But we must judge. We must decide what to remember and how to remember it. The treaty system provides a framework for this. It prioritizes science. It prioritizes peace. It prioritizes the future over the past. Historical sites are protected only if they do not conflict with scientific research. If a hut stands in the way of a weather station, the station wins. This is the hierarchy of values. Science first, history second, politics nowhere. This is a unique arrangement. It is not found anywhere else on Earth. It is specific to Antarctica, and it is worth preserving. The psychological impact on modern researchers working in this environment cannot be overstated. They live in the same stations built during the Cold War. They walk on the same ice surveyed by Ritscher and Byrd. They are aware of the history. They are aware of the myths. They are asked about Nazi bases by journalists. They are asked about UFOs by tourists. They must navigate these questions while doing serious science. It is a burden. They are scientists, not mythbusters. But they are the witnesses. They are the ones on the ground. Their testimony carries weight. When they say there are no bases, people should listen. When they say the ice is melting, people should listen. They are the successors to the explorers of the 1940s. But their mission is different. They are not claiming territory. They are monitoring health. The health of the ice. The health of the ecosystem. The health of the global climate. This shift in mission is profound. It represents a maturation of humanity's relationship with the planet. From exploitation to stewardship. From conquest to care. The early expeditions were about taking land, taking resources, taking data for national advantage. The modern expeditions are about giving data to the world, giving protection to the environment, giving warning about climate change. This is the positive legacy of the Antarctic system. It transformed the purpose of presence. It turned soldiers into scientists. It turned bases into laboratories. It turned competition into collaboration. This transformation is not complete. There are still tensions. There are still national interests. But the direction is clear. The trajectory is toward cooperation. The history of the 1930s and 40s shows where we came from. The history of the 1950s and 60s shows how we changed. The history of today shows where we are going. And the future depends on maintaining this course, on resisting the pull of old habits, on recognizing that the ice is not a resource to be used, but a system to be understood. The declassified files tell us what was planned. The ice tells us what happened. The scientists tell us what is happening now. All three voices are needed. The planner, the witness, the observer. Together they form a complete picture. A picture of ambition, of error, of correction, and of hope. The hope that we can learn, that we can adapt, that we can choose differently than we did in the past. The ice allows us this choice. It is still there. It is still waiting. It is still giving us time. But not forever. The window is closing. The ice is melting. The clock is ticking. The decisions made in the 1940s shaped the present. The decisions made now will shape the future. The history is not just about what happened then. It is about what we do now. The legacy of Swabia and Operation Highjump is not in the ground. It is in the choices we make today. To protect, to cooperate, to value truth over myth. This is the real secret. Not hidden in files, but hidden in plain sight. In the ice, in the wind, in the silence. It is waiting to be understood, and it is waiting to be acted upon. The past is fixed. The future is not. And Antarctica holds the key to both. Behind every declassified document, there is a human being who signed it. Behind every classified file, there is a person who was told not to speak. The history of Antarctica in the mid-20th century is not just about ships and planes. It is about the men who crewed them, the men who flew over the ice, the men who wintered in the dark, and the men who decided what the world should know about them. The burden of secrecy is heavy. It shapes lives. It alters legacies. Captain Alfred Ritscher lived for 18 years after the war. He died in 1963. In his later years, he was asked about the expedition. He spoke of the science. He spoke of the navigation. He did not speak of the politics. He did not speak of the orders. He lived in a Germany that was rebuilding, that was trying to come to terms with its past. His silence was part of that national silence. Was it guilt? Was it duty? Or was it simply the habit of a naval officer who understood that some things were not for public discussion? We cannot know his inner thoughts. We only have his actions. He did not seek fame for the expedition. He did not write a sensational memoir. He archived his data. He allowed it to be used for science. In this small way, he redeemed the mission. Not the ideology that funded it, but the knowledge that was gained. He turned a tool of expansion into a tool of understanding. This is a choice. Every participant in these expeditions made choices. Some chose to follow orders. Some chose to speak out. Some chose to remain silent. The sum of these choices created the history we have today. Admiral Byrd's trajectory was different. He became a public figure. He used his fame to advocate for Antarctic preservation. In his later years, he spoke less about strategy and more about science. He understood that the continent's value was not in its resources, but in its isolation. He saw the future of climate research before most people understood the concept. He pushed for the United States to maintain a presence, but he argued that the presence should be peaceful. He was a man of his time, a naval officer, a patriot, but he evolved. He saw the devastation of World War II. He saw the potential for nuclear destruction, and he chose to dedicate his final years to protecting a piece of the Earth from that destruction. This evolution is significant. It shows that individuals can change, that leaders can learn, that the tools of war can be repurposed for peace. Byrd died in 1957, just before the Antarctic Treaty was signed, but his work laid the foundation. His advocacy influenced the negotiators. His legacy is not just the runways at McMurdo. It is the idea that Antarctica belongs to science. This idea was not inevitable. It was fought for. It was argued over. It was won by men who understood the stakes. They knew that if Antarctica became a battlefield, the entire planet would suffer. They knew that the ice was too important to be owned. This wisdom was hard-won. It came from the experience of Highjump, from the challenges of the Cold War, from the recognition that competition had limits. The Soviet scientists who staffed the early stations faced a different kind of silence. They worked under a regime that controlled information tightly. They could not publish freely. They could not travel freely. They could not share data without approval. Yet they did remarkable work. They discovered Lake Vostok, the largest subglacial lake in the world. They drilled the deepest ice cores. They recorded the lowest temperatures. They did this with limited resources, with outdated equipment, with immense personal sacrifice. Many suffered health problems from the isolation, from the cold, from the psychological strain. They were heroes of science, but they were not celebrated as heroes of the state. Their names were often omitted from reports. Their contributions were attributed to the collective. This erasure is a loss to history. When we declassify Soviet files, we find individual names. We find personal logs. We find letters home. These documents restore their humanity. They remind us that behind the Iron Curtain, there were people who cared about knowledge, people who endured hardship for the sake of discovery. Recognizing their contributions is an act of historical justice. It acknowledges that science transcends borders, that curiosity is universal, that the pursuit of truth is a shared human endeavor. The Cold War tried to divide the world, but the scientists in Antarctica refused to be divided. They shared data. They helped each other. They proved that cooperation was possible even when governments were hostile. This is a powerful lesson. It shows that people are not their governments, that individuals can build bridges even when leaders build walls. The ethics of classification remain a contentious issue. When is it right to keep history secret? National security is a valid concern. Protecting sources and methods is necessary. But when does security become censorship? When does protection become obstruction? The 60-year delay in releasing Antarctic documents prevented public understanding. It allowed myths to grow. It fueled distrust. If the files had been released in the 1960s, the conspiracy theories might not have gained traction. The truth would have been available. The speculation would have been unnecessary. This is the cost of secrecy. It creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Misinformation rushes in to fill it. Governments must balance security with transparency. They must recognize that an informed public is essential for democracy, that history belongs to the people, not to the state. The gradual declassification of Antarctic records is a positive step, but it must continue. There are still files locked away, still records unprocessed, still stories untold. The process of openness is as important as the information itself. It signals a commitment to truth. to accountability, to the idea that we can handle the complexity of our past. We do not need simplified myths. We need nuanced history. We need to know that heroes were flawed, that villains were human, that decisions were made with incomplete information. This is the truth. It is messy, it is complicated, but it is real, and it is worthy of our attention. The transition from strategic asset to environmental sanctuary is the most significant legacy of this era. In the 1940s, Antarctica was seen as a potential base, a potential resource pool, a potential battlefield. Today, it is seen as a climate regulator, a scientific laboratory, a global commons. This shift did not happen by accident. It was the result of deliberate policy, of scientific advocacy, of public pressure. The Antarctic Treaty System is the framework, but the spirit behind it is stewardship. The recognition that some places are too valuable to exploit, that some resources are too critical to consume, that some knowledge is too important to withhold. This is a mature perspective. It reflects a growing understanding of planetary limits. We cannot consume indefinitely. We cannot expand endlessly. We must live within boundaries. Antarctica teaches this lesson. It is a continent of limits, of ice, of cold, of isolation. It demands respect. It demands humility. It demands cooperation. The nations that operate there have learned this. They have formed a community. They share logistics. They share data. They share risks. This community is a model for the world. It shows that competition can be managed, that conflict can be prevented, that shared interests can overcome divided ideologies. This is not naive idealism. It is pragmatic necessity. The cost of conflict in Antarctica is too high. The benefit of cooperation is too great. The math is simple. The politics are complex. But the outcome is clear. Peace works. War does not. Science thrives. Conflict destroys. This is the lesson of the ice. As we look to the future, the pressures on this system are increasing. Climate change is the primary threat. The ice is melting faster than predicted. The ecosystems are shifting. The scientific urgency is growing. But there are also geopolitical pressures. New nations are seeking consultative status. Existing nations are expanding their presence. Tourism is booming. Fishing is contested. The mining ban is subject to review in 2048. These challenges test the strength of the treaty. They test the commitment of the parties. They test the resolve of the scientific community. The history of the 1930s and 40s shows what happens when competition dominates. The history of the 1950s and 60s shows what happens when cooperation prevails. We have both models. We have both outcomes. We can choose which path to follow. The decisions made in the next decade will determine the future of the continent. Will it remain a reserve for peace and science? Or will it become a zone of economic competition? The answer lies not in the ice. It lies in us, in our governments, in our institutions, in our values. The declassified files tell us what was possible in the past. The climate data tells us what is at stake in the future. The choice is ours. We can repeat the mistakes of the Cold War, or we can learn from them. We can prioritize short-term gain, or we can prioritize long-term stability. We can see Antarctica as a resource, or we can see it as a responsibility. The history we have examined in this documentary provides the context. It shows the risks. It shows the benefits. It shows the consequences of actions. It does not provide the answer. It provides the information. And information is the first step toward wisdom. The men who flew over the ice in 1939 did not know the future. The men who sailed to Highjump in 1946 did not know the future. They acted based on the knowledge they had, based on the priorities of their time. We have more knowledge now. We have more perspective. We have the benefit of hindsight. This brings responsibility. We cannot claim ignorance. We know the value of the ice. We know the cost of conflict. We know the importance of cooperation. To ignore this knowledge would be a failure, not just of policy, but of morality. The ice remembers. The documents remember. And now, we must remember, not just the facts, but the lessons, not just the dates, but the decisions, not just the events, but the ethics. This is the burden of history. To learn, to apply, to choose wisely. The next block will conclude this story, but the story itself is not over. It continues, in the labs, in the negotiations, in the ice, and in us. The story of New Swabia and Operation Highjump ends not with a revelation, but with a reflection. Not with a secret uncovered, but with a truth acknowledged. The ice does not give up its mysteries easily, but it does reward patience. It rewards rigor. It rewards respect. The documents we have examined, the German logs, the American reports, the Soviet records, tell a consistent story. A story of exploration, of ambition, of competition, and ultimately, of cooperation. This is not a simple narrative. It is not a tale of heroes and villains. It is a human story, flawed, complex, evolving, and it is still being written. The men who flew over Antarctica in 1939 did not know they were creating a baseline for climate science. The men who sailed to the ice in 1946 did not know they were building the infrastructure for international research. The men who negotiated the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 did not know they were creating a model for global governance. They acted in their moment, with the knowledge they had, with the priorities of their time. We judge them not by our standards, but by theirs, and we learn from their choices, both the wise ones and the flawed ones. The myth of the Nazi base will not disappear. It is too compelling, too dramatic, too useful as a story, but we can choose how we engage with it. We can treat it as entertainment, as fiction, as a thought experiment, but we must not confuse it with history. History requires evidence. It requires verification. It requires the hard work of archives and analysis. This work is not glamorous. It does not make for exciting trailers, but it is essential because truth matters, because facts matter, because the decisions we make today depend on an accurate understanding of the past. If we believe in secret bases, we misunderstand the real challenges. If we focus on conspiracy, we miss the actual lessons. The real story of Antarctica is more valuable than any myth. It is a story of how humanity learned to manage a shared space, how we turned competition into cooperation, how we prioritized science over strategy, how we chose peace over conflict. These are not small achievements. They are rare. They are fragile. They are worth protecting, and they are worth understanding. The legacy of these expeditions is written in the ice, in the core samples that reveal past climates, in the maps that track glacier retreat, in the data that models sea level rise. The photographs taken by Ritscher in 1939 are now used to measure change. The runways built by Byrd in 1946 are now used to deliver scientists. The stations established by the Soviets in the 1950s are now hubs of international research. The tools of strategy became the tools of science. The infrastructure of competition became the infrastructure of cooperation. This transformation is not automatic. It was chosen by individuals, by institutions, by nations. It required vision. It required compromise. It required courage. The courage to admit that some places should not be owned, that some resources should not be exploited, that some knowledge should be shared. This courage is still needed today, as climate change accelerates, as geopolitical tensions rise, as the pressure on global commons increases. Antarctica offers a model, not of perfection, but of possibility, of what can be achieved when nations work together, when science leads policy, when long-term thinking overrides short-term gain. The declassification of documents was not just about revealing history. It was about trusting the public, about acknowledging that citizens can handle complexity, that they can understand nuance, that they can engage with difficult truths without resorting to simplification. This trust is essential for democracy, for accountability, for progress. When governments hide information, they breed suspicion. When they share information, they build understanding. The gradual release of Antarctic records is a positive example. It shows that transparency is possible, that secrets can be retired, that history can be reclaimed by the people. This process must continue. There are still files locked away, still records unprocessed, still stories untold. Each document released is a step toward a more informed public, toward a more responsible citizenry, toward a more honest relationship between government and governed. This is not just about Antarctica. It is about how we handle history in general, about how we balance security with openness, about how we honor the past while preparing for the future. The human cost of these expeditions must not be forgotten. The men who died in crashes, the men who suffered from isolation, the men who carried the weight of secrecy, they deserve recognition, not as heroes of ideology, but as humans who endured, who explored, who contributed to knowledge. Their stories are part of the historical record. Their sacrifices are part of the legacy. We honor them not by mythologizing them, but by remembering them accurately, by acknowledging their humanity, by learning from their experiences. This is respectful. This is ethical. This is historical. The ice does not distinguish between nations. It does not care about flags or ideologies. It simply is, and it demands the same respect from all who venture upon it. The men who learned this lesson became advocates for protection, for preservation, for peace. Their testimony shaped the treaty. Their experience informed the policy. Their legacy lives in the system that governs Antarctica today. This is the true monument. Not a statue, not a plaque, but a functioning framework for international cooperation. A model that has held for over 60 years. Through crises, through conflicts, through change. It is not perfect, but it works. And in a world of instability, that is remarkable. As we conclude this documentary, we return to the central question. Why does this history matter? Not just to historians, not just to enthusiasts, but to all of us. The answer lies in the present, in the challenges we face. Climate change, resource scarcity, geopolitical tension. These are global problems. They require global solutions. Antarctica shows that such solutions are possible, that nations can set aside differences, that science can guide policy, that cooperation can overcome competition. This is not naive optimism. It is documented reality. It has happened. It is happening. It can happen again, but only if we choose it, only if we value truth over myth, only if we prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage, only if we recognize that some places are too important to fight over, too valuable to exploit, too fragile to ignore. Antarctica is one of those places, and the history we have examined teaches us how to protect it, not with weapons, not with walls, but with wisdom, with dialogue, with shared purpose. The ice will outlast us. It has seen millennia. It will see millennia more. Our presence on it is brief. Our impact, however, can be lasting. We can leave a legacy of protection or a legacy of exploitation. The choice is ours. The history of the 1930s and 40s shows the risks of ambition unchecked. The history of the 1950s and 60s shows the rewards of cooperation embraced. We have both examples. We have both outcomes. We can learn. We can adapt. We can choose wisely. The declassified documents are not just records of the past. They are guides for the future. They show what was possible, what was attempted, what was achieved. They do not dictate our choices, but they inform them. And informed choices are better choices. This is the value of history, not to provide answers, but to provide context, not to tell us what to think, but to help us think better. The story of Swabia and Operation Highjump is a case study. In ambition, in secrecy, in competition, and in the possibility of transcendence, of turning tools of war into tools of peace, of turning rivals into partners, of turning a contested frontier into a shared sanctuary. This is not inevitable. It is chosen, and it can be chosen again. The final image is not of a secret base, not of a hidden document, not of a conspiracy revealed. It is of the ice itself, vast, white, silent, indifferent to our claims, unmoved by our myths. It simply exists, and in its existence, it teaches. It teaches humility. It teaches patience. It teaches respect. It teaches that some things are larger than us, that some truths are revealed slowly, that some lessons require time. The men who flew over this ice in 1939 did not understand its full value. The men who sailed to it in 1946 did not understand its global significance. The men who negotiated its protection in 1959 understood more, but not everything. Understanding is a process. It is cumulative. It is collective. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before. We benefit from their knowledge. We learn from their mistakes. We build on their achievements. This is how progress happens, not in leaps, but in steps, not in revelations, but in accumulations. The history of Antarctica is a testament to this, to the slow, hard work of understanding, of cooperation, of protection. It is not finished. It is ongoing, and we are part of it now. Our choices matter. Our actions matter. Our commitment to truth, to science, to peace matters. The ice is watching, not literally, but metaphorically. It records our impact. It reflects our values. It responds to our stewardship. What we do today will be written in the ice tomorrow, in the layers of snow, in the cores of glacier, in the data of satellites. The record is being written now, by us, Let us write it wisely. Let us write it with care. Let us write a legacy that honors not just the explorers of the past, but the planet we share. The ice remembers. The documents remember. And now, we must remember too. Not just the facts, but the responsibility. Not just the history, but the future. Not just the story, but the choice. The choice to protect, to cooperate, to value truth over myth, to prioritize peace over power, to see Antarctica not as a resource to be used, but as a gift to be preserved. This is the lesson of the ice. This is the legacy of the expeditions. This is the challenge for us all. The story does not end here. It continues. In the labs, in the negotiations, in the ice, and in us. Choose wisely. Act responsibly. Remember always, the ice is waiting, and it is worth protecting.